Jay here, welcome to Eons of Battle. Today I want to tell you about how to collect Space Marines in 10th edition. Now, other than the Leagues of Votann, Space Marines are without a doubt the most popular faction in all of Warhammer 40,000. Most people have some Space Marines, and there's probably a lot of brand new Space Marine players who bought the Leviathan box for the Tyranids, but they ended up with a bunch of Space Marine models. Space Marines are an incredibly fun army to play, but they're a little bit tricky to collect. And the reason for that is because they have a massive codex. And so it's really hard to know what units you should pick for an army of Space Marines in 10th edition and which models that you should probably kind of avoid. Now, the way Warhammer 40,000 works is every army has its own army rule, and the Space Marine one is pretty darn good. It's called Oath of Moment. Every single turn, the Space Marine player gets to pick one enemy unit and say, I pick that one. And for the rest of that turn, that unit, every Space Marine unit is rerolling hits against that unit. It used to be rerolling hits and rerolling wounds, but that was way too good, so Games Workshop just cut it down to just rerolling hits, and that's probably fair, and it's a really good unit. Now, getting rerolling hits is not the hardest thing to do, so a little pro tip from someone who's played a lot of Space Marines in 10th edition: be very selective of your Oath of Moment target, because it's not usually the thing that your entire army is definitely going to be shooting at all game long. Sometimes, usually you build your armies around certain buffs and certain benefits, so you should always treat your Oath of Moment target as something that you would something that your opponent wouldn't guess. If your opponent's like, oh yeah, they're gonna try to kill my tank. Nope, I'm gonna Oath of Moment that one squad of guardsmen over on that objective. And then they're gonna forget about it, and all of a sudden that guardsman squad is just gonna get wiped, while the rest of your army, which is already really good at shooting, is probably also gonna be able to deal with that tank. But after your army rule, then you have detachments. And detachments are what adds fun and flavor to Warhammer 40,000. It kind of helps direct you in a way to build your army. And Space Marines have access to 19 different detachments if you look at every single different type of Space Marine there is out there. But really, there's only 2 detachments that you absolutely should know about. And that is Gladius Task Force and Iron Storm Spearhead. Gladius Task Force is the classic Space Marine one. At the start of the game, you pick one of 3 benefits. Number 1 is a unit can shoot in the turn in which it advanced. This one is really good, especially if you want to play aggressively and just be moving up, but option number 2 is probably better for that. A unit is available to shoot and declare a charge in a turn in which it fell back. Now, falling back isn't fun to do, but if you just get to act normally afterwards, it makes this an incredibly powerful rule. Sometimes it's called the bully rule, where literally, even if your enemy tries to tie you up in close combat, you just get to walk away and then do whatever you want. This is probably the one to go for. And the last one is a unit is eligible to declare a charge in a turn in which it advanced. This one is really good for buffing close combat focused Space Marine armies, but Space Marines don't love to get into close combat. And yes, unless you're a Black Templar player like me, but then you're playing Righteous Crusade and living your best life. So for Gladius Task Force, you probably want to pick either option 1 or option 2. And the second detachment to know about is Iron Storm Spearhead. This one is really good at buffing every single one of your units all game long. Every unit can pick to reroll either 1 hit, 1 wound, or 1 damage roll. This is just great across the board. This detachment is very vehicle focused, but it doesn't only benefit your vehicles, it is just an overall incredibly solid detachment. It makes your Space Marines even scarier. But in terms of Space Marines, what are the Space Marines to get? Because there is a list a mile long of Space Marine units, and how do you know what you should be collecting and what you shouldn't be? Well, I think more importantly than focusing on the individual units is focusing on the battlefield roles. What do Space Marines have to do to actually win a game of Warhammer 40,000? It has taken me a lot of games to start to understand these ideas, but there's 3 key roles that you should fulfill when you're writing your Space Marine army list. And the most important one is you want something big and brutal. Something that is going to move up the board and stand on that objective that is just going to be fought over for the entire game. And great units for this are things that are incredibly tanky. And number 1 in the tanky category is Terminators. I absolutely love Terminators. They are by definition tanky. They are the coolest thing. They have a 5-up invulnerable save and a 2-up normal save. So usually they're saving on a really nice dice roll. Incredibly hard for your opponent to shift. They're good in close combat. They're decent at shooting, especially with their Cyclone missile launcher. There is a lot of really fun stuff to do with the Terminators, and they have a special rule where Before the game starts, you can take their teleport homer and put it anywhere on the battlefield. Well, anywhere on the battlefield that's not in the enemy's deployment zone. Now, the thing that this teleport homer does is it gives you free rapid ingress to that teleport homer, and you can place it anywhere on the battlefield that is not in your enemy's deployment zone. Now, what you'd think about this teleport homer is that you want to place it somewhere that you can rapid ingress to, but more likely you're going to use it to troll your opponents. You take it and you just, you kind of look at your opponent and you see where are their eyes going on the battlefield, and then you just put it somewhere they're looking at, like all the way on the left-hand side objective. And then all of a sudden your opponent's like, oh yeah, I know that teleport homer's there. I know you're gonna try to bring in your Terminators, and they kind of shift their army to go deal with the teleport homer. And then when they finally do it, they're like, haha, now you can't rapid ingress there. And then you can just say, yeah, I was never going to. And then you put your Terminators over there. It's great. I love the teleport homer. It's a super fun rule. I love trolling my opponent, and that's what the Terminators are for. They're not necessarily going to win you the game. They're not going to kill loads and loads of things, but where they're going to be is a unit that you can count on. A unit that's not going to die in a single turn. It's going to be able to hold that objective, especially if it's backed up by other units in your Space Marine army. I think Terminators are a great pick for this role, but I don't think they're the only pick. Aggressors also fit this role really nicely. They're 3 wounds apiece at toughness 6, so they're very, very hard to shift. And they have some close combat, or some close range anti-infantry firepower. The Boltstorm Gauntlets, which is essentially just heavy bolters under each of their arms, are very good, but I would say the Flamestorm Gauntlets are even better, especially for fulfilling this role of just being a giant speed bump that your opponent has to deal with, but almost can't because it's so tanky. The great thing about the Flamestorm Gauntlets is they have access to the Overwatch stratagem. Usually, things that shoot fire are really good for Overwatch because Overwatch, you only hit on 6s, unless you're a flamer weapon that doesn't have to roll the hits. So all of a sudden, if your opponent, like even Chaos 8 bound, who really want to charge in and try to move this giant roadblock, they're charging into 6d6 strength 4 AP-1 shots that are auto hitting. So they're not just hitting on 6s, they're hitting on anything, or they've automatically hit and are moving on to the wound phase. So anything charging in to try to deal with this unit is going to have to get through those Flamestorm Gauntlets. And even when they make it into close combat, they still have to deal with the Power Fist on the aggressors. They're a really, really fun unit for this battlefield role. And the last unit I would suggest for this is Blade Guard Veteran. Blade Guard Veteran are swords and boards Space Marines. They have a big ol' sword and a big ol' shield. They're pretty good in close combat, but the real meat of this unit is the 4-up invulnerable save. 4-up invulnerable save is really, really nice because it means you are always, no matter what weapon is coming at you, whether it's a rocket launcher or a las cannon, you are saving 50% of the time. 50% of the time, your opponent does no damage to you. It is phenomenal. It makes for an incredibly tanky unit that is really aggravating for your opponent to deal with, and that is what you want. You want one big, tasty brick of something that your opponent just can't quite make it through in 1 turn. They might do it in 2, it might take them 3 to shift this unit, and they're probably devoting a ton of their army to dealing with it. Now that you got your big brick, you need something to do your objective shenanigans, either taking secondary or primary objectives. And this is not the most exciting thing in the game, but it is the thing that is actually going to win you the game by scoring you points. 2 units that I would suggest for this are Space Marine Scouts, not the most exciting data sheet in the world, but they're really cheap and they have a really, really good special rule. At the end of your opponent's turn, you can yoink them off the board, and then in your turn, you can put them back on through strategic reserves. And this is incredibly powerful for doing secondary missions or even primary missions if there's an objective close enough to a board edge. But another really good use for this is, once again, trolling your opponents. The scouts were over there a minute ago. Boom, they're over on the other side of the board now, and your opponent just has to deal with that, and there's nothing they can do to prevent that. Even if you don't have, even if they're not scoring you points every single turn, you can still be trolling your opponent every single turn, and you always should. And speaking of scoring you points, another great unit for this is Space Marine Inceptors. A little bit expensive for what they are, and they're kind of good at shooting and killing, but they're really, really good at scoring you points because they have a special ability where they can deep strike within 3 inches of an enemy unit, and this is really powerful. If you pull Investigate Signals and you have to be on a table edge, you can just deep strike them basically wherever you want. If you have to be in the middle of the board, they can deep strike right on it. If there is an objective that is unsecured by your opponent, they can just land right on top of it. And they have a movement of 10 and pretty darn good guns. So even if they spend a couple of turns just scoring you points and bouncing around the board, throwing them at an enemy is actually really, really powerful. Space Marine Inceptors are a great pick. And the last battlefield role for your Space Marines to do on the tabletop to make your games of Warhammer really fun and give you a good chance of success is picking a unit that will stand on your home field objective. It's not the most fun tactical role in the world to just stand around all game, not doing a whole lot, but it's important to pick a unit that is cheap enough that you don't mind them standing around, but also tough enough that they don't get wiped off the board if your opponent tries to do something sneaky and get into your back lines. I think some really good units for this are good old Space Marine Intercessors. They're a one squad of Space Marine Intercessors, 5 dudes, is decently tanky, toughness 4, 2 wounds apiece, objective control 2. And what's really nice about regular old Space Marine Intercessors is they have objective secured. They have sticky objectives. If they're standing on an objective, which they will be turn 1, that objective is claimed by the Space Marine player even if they get off. So if your opponent tries to sneakily get around the board and get into your backfield, the Intercessors can actually leave the objective behind and go shoot and charge that unit and try to deal with it, and you still are in control of that objective. They're not expensive, they're really, really fun. Every Space Marine player should probably have a couple of normal Space Marines hanging around, and they're just a really good pick. And speaking of really good picks, another good unit for this is Space Marine Infiltrators. Now, Infiltrators don't have objective control, but they do have a really interesting special rule where nothing can come on the board through reserves within 12 inches of them. And this is really, really nice because it means your opponent can't do any sneaky shenanigans of trying to get onto your home field objective. They're gonna have to deploy more than 12 inches away, which means that they cannot charge the turn they arrive. So they're gonna have to march up towards your guys. And speaking of those guys, they have Feel No Pain 6-up. Feel No Pain 6-up is probably not something that you should count on, but Space Marines have 2 wounds apiece, so that squad has 10 wounds, so statistically, it should save you some wounds over the course of the game. They're just a really, really nice utility unit to have on your backfield, and it will really help you in your games of Warhammer 40,000. If you have these 3 types of units, if you got the tough, like, nugget of your army, if you've got the things that are gonna be scoring you points, and if you have something to stand on your home field objective, that should add up to about half to 2/3 of your army in terms of points. After that, you can get anything you want. The sky is the limit. Any miniature that you think is really, really cool or you really want to play with, those are the units to then fill in the gaps between those units that are going to win you the game. In terms of really fun things to get, a vehicle is always nice, and one of the best Space Marine vehicles is the Gladiator of any variety. The Gladiator Lancer has an incredibly powerful las cannon, and it shows up in most competitive 40k lists, but the other 2 Gladiator tanks are also very good. The Gladiator Valiant and the Gladiator Reaper are both aimed at tackling different types of targets, but really you can't go wrong with any variant of a Gladiator. And speaking of things you can't go wrong with, a Dreadnought. All 3 versions of the Redemptor Dreadnoughts are super tanky, they're walking tanks. They're super fun to play with. They're super annoying for your opponent because unless they're playing like Imperial Guard, it's a really tough nut to crack, a good old fashioned Dreadnought. And just in terms of having fun, like a walking tank is really, really fun to play with. In terms of actually starting a Space Marine army, Games Workshop has made this easy. They have a product which is called Combat Patrol Space Marines. They did a really good job of putting this together so that we can all avoid it like the plague. Don't buy Combat Patrol Space Marines. It's built out of the Leviathan models. You get 5 Terminators, you get 5 Infernus Marines, you get Captain and Terminator armor and Librarian and Terminator armor. You probably don't want any of these units. The Terminators are good. However, they are the monopose Terminators from the Leviathan box, so you are stuck with that assault cannon when you probably want the Cyclone missile launcher. And in terms of value, it's only $11 cheaper than buying all those units separately. And if you buy them separately, you get the multi-part plastic kits that come with all of the options that are not available in the Leviathan box. So don't pick Combat Patrol Space Marines. Instead, pick Combat Patrol Blood Angels Space Marines. Combat Patrol Blood Angels Space Marines is a wonderful box. It'll get you 5 Infiltrators, which I already mentioned, 5 Intercessors, which I already mentioned, 3 Aggressors, which I already mentioned, and Librarian and Terminator armor, and an Impulsor. All of those units are absolutely phenomenal. They're great gets for any Space Marine army. I think if you want a big box of Space Marines, you should definitely go with Combat Patrol Blood Angels. It's a great way to start a Space Marine army or add to an existing Space Marine army. Now, in terms of finishing off a good Space Marine army, I have a couple of weird and wacky honorable mentions. But first, let me tell you about our Patreon. Ever wanted to fight your battles in the labyrinthine hallways of a starship, moving your models in tight formation through a maze of corridors, bulkheads, and junctions where retreat is impossible and danger is around every corner? Well, the Eons of Battle Starship Interior is here to make your dreams a reality. For the month of July, subscribers to our Patreon will receive the Starship Interior, a set of claustrophobic, dynamic, and modular hallways that are scaled to perfectly suit wargaming miniatures and give you a new way to play. And if you always want to be up to date on the goings on here at Eons of Battle and be entered into our monthly giveaways, this month we're picking 3 followers to win this month's terrain. You can follow the link in the description to sign up to our newsletter. In terms of units to fill out a Space Marine army, one unit that I have been having a ton of success with is Space Marine Incursors. Incursors are built out of the Infiltrators box. You can either build them as Incursors or Infiltrators. Infiltrators have a ton of utility, but Incursors are also excellent. They have Assault Bolters, so they can move, advance, and still shoot. And they're not going to do much. They're not going to do much damage. If they're going up against like guardsmen, they'll kill some models, but their best ability is to incur something. Anything they shoot at, the rest of your army gets reroll hits against that thing. So all of a sudden you can kind of have a second Oath of Moment every single turn that the Incursors are still alive. I usually bring 2 squads of 5 and they have helped my army a ton. But they're not the weirdest Space Marine unit. The weirdest Space Marine units are actually not in the Space Marine Codex. They are in the Agents of the Imperium Codex, and you can bring up to 3. Probably don't bring 3, but you might want to bring 1. Here's one you won't hear from anybody else but me, Voidsmen at Arms. Voidsmen at Arms, they started out life as a kill team, and they're nothing. They're essentially guardsmen. They do have a decent strength for a weapon, but they're not gonna get to shoot it unless something gets ridiculously close. The real benefit to them is it's 5 guys with objective control 2, for 50 points. Point me out something in the Space Marine Codex that's only 50 points. You can't do it, but Voidsmen at Arms are 50 points. And they're not gonna do much in the game, but they could win you some points. I would say if you're like, I have 50 points, I don't know if I should get an enhancement or if I should just go into the game a little bit behind my opponent in terms of points, Voidsmen at Arms are a great pick. Leave them in reserves for the entire game until like turn 3 or 4. And then by turn 3 or 4, most of your army will be dead and most of your opponent's army will be dead. They can just march onto the board and stand on an objective that is nobody's in control of. And your opponent might not have enough stuff still alive or be able to get there in time to stop the Voidsmen from just standing there and winning you all kinds of points. They're a fantastic little unit. They're just the cutest little fellows standing next to your gigantic Space Marines. They're super cheap and I absolutely love them. And speaking of things I absolutely love, the assassins are very interesting. If I was shooting this video a few months ago, I would probably say go with the Calidus assassin. It essentially has the same rules that the scouts do, where they can get yoinked off the board and then placed back on the board, but she has deep strike, so she can deep strike anywhere. But Games Workshop recognized this, that everyone was taking the Calidus assassin, so they upped her points to 100 points, and that is too much. The assassin I would recommend is the Eversor assassin. Often overlooked, but he might be the most fun model I've played with in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. He's just one little lunatic who can move really, really fast, and he's one of the very few things in the entire game that has sustained hits 3 on his weapons. Sustained hits 3 is when you roll a 6 to hit. It is counted as 3 successful hits. So this little tiny fella can just zip around the board, run him into a squad of guardsmen, and then when he wipes most of the squad, it feels so good. He's just, it's a really, really fun model. A little bit pricey at 75 points, but I'd say if you take him, you're gonna have a really, really good time. I take him in every single game I can, and I always feel a little bit sad when I leave him at home. I have been playing the spit out of Space Marines in 10th edition, and I have been enjoying the spit out of Space Marines in 10th edition, and I wanna see everybody having just as much fun as I am. If you're starting Space Marines, I would say make sure that you got those 3 bases covered, and then you can bring anything you want and just have tons of fun. Thanks for watching.